Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is the second session of our seminar on Maximus the Confessor. Today we're looking at the introduction to On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ, and also revisiting the letter on love a little bit as we please, and referring to the two opuscula at the end of the Andrew Louth volume that we began last week. Now, I think that in general, my thoughts tonight are kind of under two themes. The first is that things are whole and are good. That things are whole and are good. That's the first. And the second is movement. Movement. So we kind of begin with the idea of wholeness and then move to a shift into movement and then come back to the idea of wholeness, which is where I hope to kind of end. But bear with me a little bit, if you will. I hope this is smoother than it feels inside. I want to start by reading from the Louth volume, page 181. It's in the lower half of the page, just after the italicized portion. This is from Opuscule 7. It's an addressed work, right? It's to a person. So this is part of the introductory salutation, greeting, according of virtue, whatever you want to call it. But what I'm interested in is what it says about time. Bottom third of the page. And again, you illuminate from the eternal mountains, I mean from the immaterial mountains, with all knowledge that transcends the senses and the power of the words and dogmas of the fathers, those who desire light, and by the taste of wisdom are already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing, as you lead and introduce them reverently to that complete transformation through experience. And that's the key part, clearly. The fathers, those who desire light, and by the taste of wisdom are already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing, as you lead and introduce them reverently to that complete transformation through experience. I'll mention now one of the words I'm interested in tonight or ongoing is a Greek word for experience, pira, because it's one of the only Greek words I know that I don't have associated with another root or something like that. I'm very interested in that term. So that sense of already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing. That's the first thing to hold in mind. I'm going to go through 3 passages and then talk for a while, and we can return to these. In the same volume, if you turn to page 197, please. And this is what's the last paragraph of the text? It's the paragraph that begins Nestorius and Severus on the bottom quarter of 197. Nestorius and Severus, therefore, have one aim in their ungodliness, even if the mode is different. For the one, afraid of confusion, flees from the hypostatic union and makes the essential difference a personal division. The other, afraid of division, denies the essential difference and turns the hypostatic union into a natural confusion. It is necessary to confess neither confusion in Christ nor division, but the union of those that are essentially different, and the difference of those that are hypostatically united, in order that the principle of the essences and the mode of the union might be reverently proclaimed. But they break asunder both of these. Nestorius only confirms a union of gnomic qualities. Severus only confirms the difference of natural qualities after the union. And both of them, both of them have missed the truth of things. I like that. They get something, but they don't get the truth. The one recklessly ascribes division to the mystery, the other confusion. So division applied to the mystery or confusion applied to the mystery. And then the earlier, page 181, it is already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing. So this is where I'm trying to get at, that things are whole and are good. And then one more passage, page 85, same volume. We looked at this last time. This is the very first part of what David read. I want to revisit that and just pause for a moment. Bottom of page 85. For nothing is more truly godlike than divine love. Nothing more mysterious, nothing more apt to raise up human beings to deification. For it has gathered together in itself all good things that are recounted by the logos of truth in the form of virtue. And it has absolutely no relation to anything that has the form of wickedness, since it is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. I like how careful he is here. For nothing is more truly godlike, okay, than divine love, love echoing the divine, the love that is divine in us, the love that the divine has revealed to us. Nothing more mysterious, profound, unfathomable, rich beyond measure. Nothing more apt to raise up human beings to deification. It doesn't say it has to, or it does. It's apt to, not guaranteed. Here's another gesture of wholeness. For it is gathered together in itself all good things that are recounted by the logos of truth in the form of virtue. That's another sentence we might return to. And it has absolutely no relation to anything that has a form of wickedness. I think of this and I think, if the world is built in relation, if we are relational beings, and if everything that is natural is in relation with everything else that is natural, and it is of creation, so it is good, that with which we have no relation, right? Here, wickedness is in fact non-existent. It's not part of God's creation. It is illusory. It is the counterfeit image of. I'm wondering if this ties into what we were talking about last week when David brought up the main distinction between love and self-love, not love and hate. Right? Sorry, David, go. I have to distinguish David here, pardon me. Continuing on here. For they were succeeded by the mystery of love, which out of human beings makes us gods. Okay, now love is more, what it does is clearer and reduces the individual commandments to a universal logos. Everything is circumscribed by love according to God's good pleasure in a single form, and love is dispensed in many forms in accordance with God's economy. We can return to these and look. I didn't look closely at them. I just read them, not in a hurry. We can return to them in a little bit. But I wanted to begin there because talking about the process of salvation as a whole, or as a whole that already is, and in a manner of speaking, already has been done, that's one thing. Speaking about your theological opponents, not as being wrong or evil, but as applying the wrong measure in the wrong time. They see division where they should see distinction, where they see composition or confusion where there should be union. Right? And it always surprises me at the beginning of that second passage I read, when he calls them ungodly. It seems so harsh for Maximus, because in my opinion, what you get is constantly his wish that in fact they would listen and come around to this way of thinking too, not oppositional. All right. And then the third passage. which David Goa began to explicate last week, in which we see the delicate interplay between love and desire and godliness play out. And we began with this letter, and it's good, and we're going to stick with love for a little bit in this Maximos thing. But maybe now is a good time to remind ourselves that the two kind of major metaphors for the center of the human being at this time, depending on the tradition, if it the Alexandrian Cappadocian kind of tradition was a little bit more centered in the nous, or the intellect, and the Anthony, and the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and other ascetics after that, Macarius, especially for Maximus, located in the heart, the cardia. That might matter in how we think about certain things. I think it should matter, and it does matter. I'm not sure how it does, though. Okay, now about movement. So my favorite contemporary Orthodox writer, Sophrony Sakharov, who's recently been recognized as having extraordinary holiness. He and his spiritual father, Saint Silouan the Athonite, there's a book about them written by Sophrony, and he recounts a visitor coming to St. Pantaleimon Monastery on Mount Athos and speaking to Saint Silouan, Father Silouan, and saying, gesturing to the library and saying, "Well, Father, these books are so rich and amazing." And he said, "Yes, they were written by the great saints before us." And the visitor said, "Well, what do you're not writing now? How come you're not writing now? Who's still writing now?" And Saint Silouan said, "Well, we don't need to write because it's all right there. We have it. But if all these books burned down, then we'd write them again and we'd have the library again." Right? It's there's a charming confidence, a charming kind of steadiness of spirit in that, an unconcern, or rather a lack of fear that if I don't do something, my tradition is going to fall down. And not do something in response, but if I don't assert myself, if I don't put myself out there, if I don't make something brilliant, my tradition will fall down. And as brilliant as Maximus is, we have already seen how, at least initially, he seems to write primarily in the occasional mode. He writes on occasion. He writes to request, or in response to something, or as a part of correspondence. What does this mean? It means he didn't feel the need to make a name for himself, to put himself out there, to assert himself, as I said. I think it also means that he realizes that the health of the tradition depends on the living of it, the conscious living of it, and the articulation of it, as important as that is a complementary register, not necessary, a complementary register. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, writing to occasion means, oh, you asked me to speak now? Okay, I will gather what we all have in common, our heritage, what is common to all of us, and I'll say it there. We all have it. I don't need to say it. We all have it, but you're asking me? Okay, I'll gather what we have and I'll put it there. I was going to skip ahead, but I'm going to go through every single note just in case any of them make sense. So pardon me. This is a matter of theological articulation as perhaps watering, moistening the soil when needed, perhaps pruning, trimming when needed. It is not building the garden itself. It's not making the plants grow. Greetings, Michael. It is when needed. This suggests to me that the major theological form, the major form in which all people in the image of God, theologos, right? The major theological form is not thinking and speaking, it's prayer. And if prayer is the major theological form, it combines ascetic and intellectual into one, then what's next? Maybe insight. Maybe insight's next. Prayer is key. This is what Saint Sophrony teaches us. Insight's next, and then elaboration. But elaboration is third and lesser, right? If the other two are strong, you don't need it. And then the only goal of theological discourse would be edification, healing, wholeness, restoration, as David Goa said last time. Now, if Maximos's occasional mode is a gathering mode, right? Gathers from the tradition what's appropriate to the situation. In his writing, his mode of presentation is also of a gathering, integrating form. We call it paratactic, setting things alongside each other. We see it constantly. Andrew Louth in his intro calls it lateral, the lateral movements, the movements sideways, not hypotactical. So often, it seems to me, Maximus's arguments or Maximus's writing proceed by analogy or analogous example, not by not even in recognizable argumentative form or kind of speculative persuasive form, side by side. And that's a movement now. Now we're talking about movement, side by side, right? Not to and from or to and towards. It's a gathering, not an ascending persuasion. And this reminds me of what David Goa said last week when we were talking about, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, but David, you said there's no hierarchy of presence. There's no hierarchy of presence. And I think that's really beautifully put. There's no hierarchy in that certain spiritual state. So Maximus says, this is filled with God's grace, and this is filled with God's grace, and this is filled with God's grace, and this story shows this, and this shows this. He holds numerous examples side by side and says, look what they witness to. Look what they witness to, this wholeness that we have. Okay, this might be a little bit of a tenuous move, but bear with me. I want to shift from talking about movement within interpretation, like movements paratactic in the text, to movement of being, as it were. So the word for wholeness, or the image of wholeness, spiritual wholeness, we have in Maximus and in other places is stasis. The word for the human being, the human personhood, is hypostasis. So the kind of essence of that stasis. And we understand that, as John Zazula says, and the church fathers write to, and it's a Maximus as well, it's drawn from Maximus, that ecstasis, the movement out of our spiritual peacefulness, is a fundamental human movement, the movement out of ourself. It's akin to what, Michael, you were saying last session about consciousness inevitably involving a movement outward, that not inward, but the procession even. Right? We use that language describing the Trinity. The movement outward. Ecstasis, essential to the human person, the movement outward, is akin, this is maybe another slightly tenuous move, akin to apophasis, which is the movement away from the term. The movement away from the term. In each case, you have the central thing, the person or the term, and then you have the movements out of the person or away from the term, which gives that person or term the profound depth that allow us to call it a mystery. One more slightly, perhaps tenuous step and then back on solid ground. But I hope these hang together. In where we are, in the cosmos, in the adornment of God, I would like to suggest now, we have two primary realms, the noetic and the aesthetic. The noetic and the aesthetic. Apophasis is proper to the noetic, and appropriate form is proper to the aesthetic, i.e. we have the what has form and what is beyond form. Apophatic is proper to the noetic, and appropriate form, or good cataphatic theology, is proper to the aesthetic, the sensible world. I think this is true. I put it out there, but I think it's true. Regardless of if I'm right, I think that Maximus's integration of the registers of the noetic and the aesthetic, or the divine and the human, or the apophatic and the appropriate, I think his integration of those registers in that ascetic tone of voice is what gives him his authority. He seems free to gather. He doesn't have to build on a certain foundation within the tradition, in a sense, because it's all there. He's talking about the whole. He can gather from St. Gregory theologian. He can gather from Dionysius the Areopagite. He can gather from Gregory of Nyssa, from the fathers, from the patriarchs, right? The integrity of that in him is what gives him his authority. And spiritual integrity, particularly in the incarnation, the integrity of personal integrity, the integrity of the human being, is key to, a key Maximos concern. It's what he's aiming at. It's what he gives his life to. Seen in the figure of Christ, warding off poor definitions, enervating definitions of Christ, in order to, again, just love that wholeness that is there, is whole, and is good. Now, that's I was going to talk a bit about him mentioning the theandric energy from Dionysius, but I think that could come up later. So I want to look at two passages that I'd like to open up and ask about and talk about and hear what you think, or if any thoughts emerge. And they're both from the on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. The first is on page 39. It's about baptism. Second paragraph on page 39. And Goa, I'm looking at you in particular here because we've talked about this before, and I'm wondering if you've been thinking about it, but not just you. So, baptism for Maximus, baptism. Alexander Schmemann wrote a whole book on baptism. He spent a whole year or two writing a book about baptism. That should tell you how central that often glossed over act is. Baptism for Maximus is the new birth by the Spirit that roots the believer in this ongoing transformative process, this new existential mode. According to Ambiguum 42, which we get to read, baptism takes its place among the three births to which humanity is subject, and which the Savior himself has honored. First, our coming into being, Genesis, as creatures made in the image of God. Second, our baptismal birth, which confers the grace of well-being, or to'u ine. And third, the ultimate birth of resurrection, whereby we attain to the grace of eternal well-being. I won't try to read that Greek. Baptism for Maximus is the new birth by the Spirit that roots the believer in the ongoing transformative process, roots in a process. This new existential mode. Now, we will recall from Andrew Lowe's introduction that mode here is the word for tropos, which is a key term in Maximus. He distinguishes logos and tropos, and often he says things like humanity has fallen on the mode of existence, on the mode of in the mode of tropos, not the mode of logos. I want to bring it back to nature. That's why I mentioned that. Baptism takes its place among the three births, the original coming into being, and then our baptismal birth, and then the ultimate birth of resurrection. Now, this trinity of terms is being, well-being, and eternal well-being, or enduring well-being. That's how it's typically translated. Being, well-being, and eternal well-being. And I've been entranced by these three terms ever since I heard. Actually, all of you will probably know better than I don't know if another major philosopher has talked about well-being as an ontological category, not as a confusion of ethical, or not as a or as a derivative term of something else. I wonder, Michael, you'd know. You might know. That's a thought. Being, well-being, and eternal well-being. So that's 39. That's the first section. And then just bear with me a couple more minutes. Top of page 35. Top of page 35. How precisely the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ inaugurated a transformation at the level of human passibility, human propensity to passion, what word did you use, David? Appetite, human propensity to appetite. A transformation that turned the very stigma of our fallen nature into a resource for ultimate personal communion with God. All right. Skip. In so doing, God not only resolves the legacy of the fall, but pioneers a whole new modality, tropos, for human passion consistent with the soul's natural and perpetually graced desire for God. Christ not only resolves the legacy of the fall, but pioneers a whole new modality, tropos, for human passion consistent with the soul's natural and perpetually graced desire for God. Now, out of those passages, or not, we have the coming into being. We have baptism as a new mode of being. We have Christ introducing a new modality into being. Last week, we began to distinguish or consider the relationship distinction between nature and, say, grace, or nature and creation. I want to consider that again, nature and creation, even including perhaps the word cosmos, if that matters there. Cosmos is the adornment of the logos. So I don't know if one wants to pull on one of these half dozen threads. But
Sure, there were
thinking
only
either,
6?
well, but even just okay, so the idea that if things are and are whole and are good and are made by God, right? That was the point of thinking about the earliest passages. Then what do we mean when we say nature and creation and fall and modality and what baptism does? That's one of the threads. And that sounds like a kind of just jumble of words. Pardon me, I don't mean to, but please.
I was first taken by your, and perhaps it's from my Protestant background, but I was taken by your recognition of the lack of anxiety that you need to get your arguments on the paper. That I need to put my propositions forward. I have to make my arguments, and I think it's a fair criticism of Protestantism that there's an anxiety based in time, that people have to come to a decision, that people have to, get it and then make a decision for Christ. And, so much of what I'm reading in Maximus is much more corporate than individual, although certainly there is individual responsibility. But it does appear, and I would be in agreement with you from my reading of it, that there isn't that same anxiety of getting it all out. And I think that comes from, in part, St. Maximus's ultimate restoration of all things. If you think that there is the ultimate restoration of all things, it probably does reduce the anxiety of doing your utmost to get a decision made by each and every person.
What if you didn't believe in the restoration of all things? Could you still not be anxious?
Not if you are morally committed, I don't think.
I wonder.
Yeah. Well, the Protestant experiment, to the extent that you think it's valid, is I can't let you die without you having made a personal commitment to Christ, and I have a moral obligation to do what I can to get you to that spot before.
Mm-hmm.
And that may not even just be Protestant; that might even be the whole West. Catholics with the last rites, etc.
This is David Goa called it the self is salvific once. Yeah, this is I'm gonna save you. It's all on me. Basically, oneself projected onto the divine. It's a horrific feeling, I imagine.
Well, first of all, it betrays an understanding of the Spirit, of the Holy Spirit, where your duty is to convert rather than simply to witness. If you have that, and to be clear, I mean, not all Protestants share that view, but it's not, certainly amongst evangelical Protestants, it's not a abnormal view. And there's much to say for it, like it's not just that, there's something after death, then you need to have ticked the box before you go, but rather living now, where eternity is a quality, not a quantity. Living now, this does it, but there is a certain anxiety at its worst, perhaps I don't know what the theological phrase for kick in the pants is, but a kick in the pants to try to share with others about this seems to be not only an imperative of the gospel, but for humans, the best way to love them.
Maybe. Yes, and yet, if you won't sell all that you own And if all that you own is your very good way with words, so you won't shut up in your closet, maybe you're not doing such a good job either. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that I didn't mean to overstate the position that Maximus was kind of peaceful necessarily about what was, it's remarkable. He did begin as an occasional writer, I think. I'm not certain on this textual trajectory, but we all know that he ended his life because he refused to stop writing, stop communicating about very, very, very fine distinctions that many of us, I bet, well, I shouldn't say that. Let's be charitable with each other and with ourselves. We might be tempted to think that can probably just let go, probably don't have to insist on that, but he did. Yeah.
Just to be clear, I think you're onto something here. Just that from my camp, I see the opposite, and I do see both the pluses, but more often the minuses. There's rarely an acknowledgement of the corporate nature of what you're talking about. And I think that's what I do find attractive in some of the writings here, especially for those who ultimately believe in the restoration of all things.
Well, I think just to pick up on that, I actually really appreciate this sort of Trinitarian idea of kind of being, well-being, and eternal well-being, as you talked about it. But for me, there's also a connection here in terms of movement to that, because it's sort of, what are we trying to become? And so I think there's something in Maximus that he's playing with, like, what is the purpose of the movement? And
Yeah.
David, your point is, I don't think it's just a Protestant thing, but there's this kind of frenetic kind of energy that sometimes sort of happens where it's sort of like, oh my God, we have to do all these things, and so I think he's sort of, or at least I was wondering about, what is in that movement in each of those steps that clearly for Maximus, as you said, it's a change in ontology, right? And that's very interesting to me because, coming from the healthcare field and doing research, I mean, one of the big things is we don't have a definition for what well-being is. I mean, everybody talks about it and we all know it's important, but we really don't know what it is or how is it. And so we end up often sort of reducing well-being to these very, to these categories or these qualities. So you sort of have well-being as sort of these 8 domains of sort of, financial health, emotional health, but they're really qualities. We don't actually know what the thing is, like, what is it? And so I think there's something here about the beingness, like, and what is that? And so for me, it was more of a question because I don't know. And maybe it's just because I'm not as familiar, but like, what is it that Maximus is pointing to? What is this movement? Because I feel like it's a very purposeful movement. There's something, especially moving into from being into well-being, because it's referring to this good. So there's obviously a teleological end to it. So what is it that it's moving towards? But just to pick up on that point, because there's something that points to that, and not to get us on a side trail, but I mean, I think very generally in broad strokes within the health research, there's this awareness that the modern world or people's health more broadly, their well-being is impacted by modernity's fast-pacedness, right? If you look at that literature, it's always tied to, life is too crazy, it's too busy, people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. The answer is sort of this sort of slow down, but slow down for what? And to do what exactly, right? And so I think this is why a lot of those things don't work. So I hope that makes sense. So it's a bit of a half-baked thought.
I'd like to walk into that just a little bit, because You know, since I was very young, baptism has always occupied a very special place in my imagination. It's so interesting to me that he speaks about baptism as being the unfolding of well-being. And when we think of what he's referring to here, the way in which the liturgy of baptism was shaped. So when a child or an adult comes for baptism, people are gathered around, and there's a whole set of things that takes place. There's a kind of baptism is itself a kind of pilgrimage. It's very vivid with infants, because one of the first acts is to separate the infant from its parents, which is the church's way of saying this child isn't the being of this child is not coterminous with the aspirations and hopes of the parents, no matter how good those might be. So there's a series of exorcisms from parents, exorcisms from tribe, from social class, even what I would call a kind of exorcism from whatever history is going to deal you. But well-being in this regard, well, of course, is a source. We draw water from the well. So in the act of baptism, which I for a long time have seen the act of baptism as not doing something to the child or to the person that's being baptized, but it is the purification of the eyes of the community. And when you think that for Maximus and for the Eastern Christian tradition, the human person doesn't exist in isolation. Your personhood exists in communion, in relationship. So what the baptism does, I mean, the child brought and stripped of its clothes and what have you, the being of the child is beautiful and whole and complete as it is. So what happens with the plunging into the water 3 times? What's the well-being? Well, it's helping the community awaken, even if it's just for a moment, to not only that the being, the logoi of the person, is the energy of God, but that this being is going to unfold and going to grow and move and hopefully experience ecstasis as well, come out of itself in responding to others and to the life of the world. So the well-being, if one thinks of baptism is of course a womb and a tomb. It's the waters of life. It's the river Jordan It's all the life-giving waters of the world. So this kind of revivifying a sense both of the beauty of the being, but also that that beauty isn't sitting still. That the source of this, the well of it, is so palpable in the ritual. And that's why so often in the liturgy for holy baptism of Chrysostom, the child will be taken and danced around, or the priest will say, Christ is in our midst. Christos. Christ is in our midst. This is the incarnation. But it is that because the community is invited to glimpse the source. So well-being isn't any different kind of being, but it is being with this enlivened sense of the presence of the source. So, Lorraine, to come to your point, so just let me suggest this. So it seems to me that for Maximus, and in this part of the Christian tradition that we're thinking about here, you can't define well-being. There is some things to check off here, but there is a sense that we are called to glimpse the presence of this being. In its intimate communion with the source of all being, with the wellspring.
David, pardon me, David. Your mic is occasionally scuffing quite badly. I think something might be rubbing up against it. Pardon me. I didn't mean to interrupt you
I'm
otherwise.
holding it in my lap. Is that okay?
Okay. It all came through, but some of it was, I just wanted to let you know. Pardon me. Please continue.
That's all. That's all.
Well, then I want to say, I don't mean to put you on it now, but I am so deeply interested, and I forgot you mentioned this before. I've always wanted to really explore this with you, the analogy between baptism and incarnation in Maximus, because he talks about baptism so often, and it's such a rich, and I know it's well, as you said, it's one of your pillars, one of the pillars of your spirit. I'm very interested in that unfolding. I like also particularly how you said well-being is not a different kind of being, but what would you say? It's being with an enlivened sense of the presence of the source. Yes.
It's bubbling.
That's it reminds me of your notion that, or what you taught me, that blessing is always recognition. And as you were describing the baptism, I thought, of course, we're just recognizing the child for what it is, which is what, as you linked it, the incarnation is about. Recognizing the God, the divine, for what it is. It is you and me. And on a unrelated thought, I always thought that the incarnation, the Feast of the Incarnation, was really just about the goodness of humanity. And the Feast of Theophany was really just about the goodness of creation. And those two feasts together bless the cosmos.
Maybe it's because I come at it with a whole bunch of scabs built up, not having read this, but I think that what baptism also does is not just an acknowledgement of what is, but it's also what I think I took from David is it's a challenge of what is not. That is, the parents who think that they own the child are told in this ceremony that at best they are guardians. That the child is not theirs. The child is dead to them through the drowning of the child, in a sense. And its resurrection makes it Christ's child, and the role of the parent is that of guardian. There's a whole bunch of, and I think you said that the baptism is to make alive to the community the reality that is before it, rather than its own misconstrual of reality.
Yeah.
And we get a glimpse in that moment of Christ as we encounter reality. So, Andrew, I think it's not just, although it's enough to be that, the what is, but it's also a challenge to what is not, the perception that is brought to it by human sinfulness and ignorance.
I agree completely. I agree completely with both how you just put it and with how David discussed it earlier. Yeah. I didn't mean to preclude another thing. I just was focusing in on that. I wanted to comment on something David Goy, you said, and then ask Lorraine you a question. If I'm right, David, then what you're saying, or what you might be hinting at, or what might be contained in your very nice, very beautiful distinction between being and well-being, is that is the, or I should say, is there a relation between that and the sort of thing we're trying to get at when we use terms like creation, nature, essence in the world? Do you think that the language of being and well-being and the way that you elaborated their relation, do you think that is kind of the prism through which we should see these other sorts of questions, like nature and creation, that sort of thing? Or perhaps I'm straying, but what do you think?
Well, sometimes when we speak about nature, I think we kind of have implied in that something that is, something that's fixed, or certainly the way in which that word is used by the Apostle Paul at times, it's referring to our pornographic view as opposed to an iconographic view. That is, it's referring to, Paul speaks about the flesh all the time. That is where the assumption is that it is something, and it's frozen.
Not static though, not because we talked
No,
about
it's not
stasis
static.
earlier.
It's
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
static, it's frozen.
Yeah.
They're different, huh?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's a received image that is then imposed. It's transferred on it. It's assuming it to be something. And all of the exorcisms in the baptism ritual are all about trying to help people see that as good as those things might be, as David has said, as good as the aspirations and hopes and dreams of parents are, it's not that that's not good. It's just that it's not real. And that's a tragedy. So I've been often struck at some baptisms that I've been at, Orthodox baptisms, to realize how often people weep. And I think, isn't that interesting? They got it. I mean, I don't think they could articulate it, but they've realized what this is doing. It is saying, hold on. There's something much more profound here. You're going to have to let go of some stuff. You have to let go of your hope and dreams, your presumptions.
David, I didn't quite hear you. I have to let go
Of your hopes and dreams, your presumptions about the child. You're going to have to let go of the tribal identifications.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because all of those matters, whether they're, no matter how good they might be, they aren't who this is. This is the image of God. So all of those things are idolatries. They're equivalent of idolatries. And the real question for human beings is how to be free of our idolatries so we can actually live. So we can be attentive to reality.
Mm.
The idolatries are never real, no matter how good they might be.
And idolatries are addressed by theology, and living is addressed by community.
Yes, when community is ecclesia.
Indeed, with that distinction, indeed. Wow. It's crazy.
David, a fun story. I don't know if those outside the Protestant circle know who Will Willimon is, but
Oh yeah, he's great.
yeah,
Huh?
great guy. Among other things, he was the chaplain at Duke, and he writes in one of his books. He tells the story of some parents who were terribly upset with him and started to chew him out at the back of a church service after their daughter had announced that she was going to join an order as a result of her Christian faith. And they were a little upset with Will Willimon and his involvement in all this because they had great plans for their daughter. And Will Willimon, being, as you know, a fairly forthright guy, he just turned to them and said, did you have her baptized? And they said, well, yeah, as a kid. And they said, well, it's your own damn fault. It's like, I mean, this is what you're getting at, is that the power of baptism goes far beyond what certainly in the Protestant circles most parents recognize. It's nice that they weep in the Orthodox tradition.
Sometimes, although lots of them turn it into a tribal ritual.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Or they think it's the
Pageantry.
ritual of becoming part of the church.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
which is just nonsense.
David, building off your idea of frozen and holding in mind the idea of stasis as
a little
the
careful
as the
here. Be a little careful here, Andrew, because David Jennings understands himself to be part of the chosen.
Chosen.
Sorry, David.
Predestined Calvinist, my heritage. Frozen chosen.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I earned that one.
That was dreadful. That was dreadful. The idea of something of things being stilled or things being frozen, and then the idea of stasis, but of stasis as a whole, which is complete, which is in time. And then, sorry, and Lorraine, this is all directed to you. Pardon me. And then directed to you, but open to everybody. And then I've always been a little bit wary about the word eternal. It seems kind of like a sun that doesn't turn off. And I was reading a Heidegger book lately, and he was distinguishing between words that indicate long stretches of time. And I thought, yeah, wait a second. And so one can think of something like eternal, which suggests never having been in time, always having been. You could think of everlasting as something like, I don't know, but it brings maybe a little bit more of a sense of movement or power or energy, something like that. You could think of enduring, something that endures. And so these are vague thoughts. Lorraine, I was wondering, when you are, if I understand what you talked about earlier, and pardon me if I don't, but when you're considering time or time span, space, however you kind of phrase it internally, when you are speaking with someone who has undergone something, with what sort of criteria or what sort of terms do you use to try to get at the essence of something that is over time or stays over time or endures or everlasts or is eternal? Or how do you get at something that isn't just immediate? I mean, it is throughout time. And what do these different terms imply? And pardon me if this is very abstruse. It's a little minor kind of curiosity of mine, maybe not so minor. Because if we think about, I mean, as we read in the introduction to this text today, the movement that Origen ascribed to human progress, which was the fall from stasis into, what was it? Movement, no, into movement and then becoming. What is it, David Koa? Is that what it is? Is it stasis, movement, becoming, and Maximus turns it around, movement becoming stasis, struggle becoming, something like that.
He does becoming, then movement, then rest, whereas Origin is rest, movement,
right.
to becoming.
Right. So Maximus is proceeding to that, as was brought up earlier. He's not just moving without, there's a telos. He's moving towards something. If we talk about what he's moving towards, sometimes the term is ever moving repose. I don't know. What does this language do? And pardon me, Lorraine, this is very, very vague, but I'm just so interested in how you've thought about time and how meaning is in time, I guess. In your theological work, in your theoretical work, and also in your practical work.
Yes, so I'm gonna have to go out here on a limb, but I hope this is meaningful. This idea of frozen for me is very powerful because in trauma there's this idea that we often only talk about fight or flight, but there's actually two other modes that people respond to, which is frozen and floppy, but mostly frozen. And in its extreme form, this is how people end up having dissociation or dissociative identity disorders, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. So bear with me here. You're going to have to go through on this little train of thought. But one of the really powerful experiences I've had when I'm working with people who have had severe trauma or complex trauma is that they are frozen in time. They are stuck. And even the term post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, is a misnomer, because people who truly have PTSD, the trauma isn't post, it's not in the past. That's the problem. Actually, all of our modalities are specifically trying to work with the brain to allow it to refile in such a way that it is actually moved into long-term storage effectively. And so what happens to these people is that they are stuck. They are frozen. Frozen in time, frozen in space, frozen in being. And you feel it. They come home, and many of my clients have come home from deployments overseas, wars, peacekeeping missions, Afghanistan combat, and they are still there. And nothing, though they move geographically, they have moved, they are not there, and time literally has gone forward. They are stuck. And the existential isolation that then occurs for them, because they are permanently stuck in this time and in this place, and there is no movement for them, and the hopelessness then that often drives them to despair and suicide or self-annihilation through substance abuse or self-harming behaviors is because there is nowhere to go. They are literally stuck forever, they believe, in this hell. And so they've maybe come home 10 years, they've been back 10 years, but they can't go anywhere. And it's not, it's not that they can't get on a plane, but they intrapsychically, they spiritually, I believe, are stuck. And that palpableness of they would say, lost their being to this experience, and continuously replay that over and over and over and over again. And it becomes for them a living hell that has no end. It has no end other than when they hope that they will get relief when they kill themselves or when they die. And so for me, when I read, sort of this organs idea, there's something for me about this fall. Like, I had that image of many of the clients I've worked with, this fall from grace. And for me, this becoming at the end that he talks about is just this becoming of a disintegration, because it's not going anywhere. If you can't go back up, right? You've fallen. Like, there's nowhere to kind of go. Versus for Maximus, this is what's so beautiful, is that there's this becoming to movement to rest.
Yeah.
And rest isn't the same as frozen. And that's kind of a tangential way, but it's the best way I can think about it. And I think, having seen that, it is so powerful to see someone's life be frozen and stuck and with nowhere to go and nowhere to be. I have no idea if that's helpful or not, or if that answers your question, Andrew.
That's beautiful.
But yeah,
Really beautiful. Oh, keep going. Pardon me.
Kind of ontological arrest.
Yeah. Deep.
mm-hmm.
I like that too, because when you, I like that, pardon me. When you move through, descended in these horrific register of experience in the people you speak with, I was thinking, yeah, that's truly hellish. That's probably as good a definition as anything is of hell. I really like how you linked it with the two opposite movements. Then that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, nicely done. Yeah, yeah. So David, if it's arrested, who's it arrested by? Stopped, arrested. I love that image. But what's involved in that image?
Well, in my conversations a little bit with Lorraine about moral injury, there is one thing that was striking to me, and maybe Lorraine, you can go a little further with this, if I've understood correctly, that this sort of harm to being, this kind of ontological injury, occurs. It's not so much about witnessing horrific things, if I recall what you said about it. It's about impotence. It's about being in the presence of something without any capacity to act, respond.
But it sounds to me like, from what Lorraine's saying, is it's more than that. It's not just being present in front of something with an inability to respond. It's being locked in that, even if what's present is no longer that. That you're still living with the perception of a reality that is based solely on some event or trauma or whatever else that might be decades old. So you're not even, it's not just merely that you're feeling incapable of responding to what's before you. What's before you isn't reality if you're stuck. I don't know. Is that right?
I thought he meant what's before you. I thought he meant what's before you in terms of that horror. I thought.
Oh, I see. Not engagement with whatever the situation is. I see.
I don't know. Maybe I misunderstood. Well,
I think there's an interesting, and it's kind of a tangential, but there's an interesting play there, and I would agree with David. It's if movement is to drive, to a certain extent, action, right? Like if movement is to drive action, then I think if we almost see it as two lines kind of going, what then in that for at least many of the people I work with, the arrest is because the action that either I took, because sometimes it is perpetration, right? It is something that I did. It's not always not that I just witnessed something, but in either or, that action, rather than, and David, I would have drawn your idea of this well, rather than being life-giving and fulfilling my nature, right? Rather than being in line with my nature, this experience, this movement, this push to do something actually becomes interrupted and impeded, and then actually unravels in some way, seeks to unravel or continuously unravels, because then I get stuck in it, my nature. Like I can no longer fulfill the very impetus or urges that I have in the good urges to do what is right, and so I end up becoming, and in that stopping, that arrest, I become frozen, because I can no longer, I either can't, or I shouldn't have, or I've been so frustrated by the experience that I can no longer be. And worst case, probably the most severe forms that I've seen, those urges have become, the very nature has become corrupted, right? So I no longer long for what I should long for. And that can be very, very tricky. But I think there is something, and sorry, it's not completely working, but I think there is something in that movement, but it's movement either that helps me to align myself and allow myself to fulfill my urges, my good appetites, or I become, those urges become interrupted and stopped, and worst case, corrupted. And so my very nature, oh sorry, I don't know if I'm using nature rightly here in light of Maximus, but there's something I think that gets shifted, tainted, and in that sense, when clients tell me they feel like they've lost their humanity, I don't think they mean that metaphor. I think they mean that in a literal sense. They've lost what it means to be a human being.
Well, it's a common theme that if being is created and creation is good, then hell is non-being. That is hell as Christianity has understood it.
This might circle back to a point earlier, which I can't recollect precisely, but just something along the lines of trying to impose too much of our view on reality and thereby making it not real in a sense. I understand. I'm not. I don't really. I'm not an expert in this area, but I understand there's some empirical evidence that people who are susceptible to TTS, sometimes it reflects on the way they were raised, their levels of expectations, and so they're on. I don't want to generalize, but there sometimes seems to be a kind of epistemic fragility that seems to be a function of having overly rigid views. And so maybe the impotence that David was suggesting that you were affirming, Lorraine, and elaborating on might relate to an inability to integrate things holistically or reintegrate them and sort of revise, reevaluate one's being, which is no easy feat, but it's probably more problematic if as an adult whole being, you were in some sense systematically less whole because your being was more rigid in its, with respect to many of your values and beliefs, they were overly rigid, misidentifying reality systematically. And I think that not simply over witnessing trauma, but even witnessing, coming up against a point of view that differs from the current worldview. Even something as simple as that can plant a seed and create a kind of frozenness, a kind of paralysis that is horrible to see unfold. And it must be, especially in the case of someone who really has witnessed horrible things. And it was interesting when you shifted a little bit and said that sometimes it's not simply a case of witnessing, but also being someone who does something against what one takes to be one's nature. And I imagine in a situation like that, it's probably very hard to welcome any kind of potential for forgiveness or anyway, that was one of the things that struck me about this exchange.
Michael, just when you began speaking, I was about to bend your ear because I think you've been thinking about this, one of the passages I read at the beginning in particular. But if we will, I want to turn back to page 181. I want to think, oh, sorry, 181 in the Louth volume, the Maximos volume, Maximus Confessor by Louth. To that first passage I read at the very beginning, towards the bottom, because there's something about time, and there's something about image, and there's something about nature, and there's something about desire, and there's something about experience, and there's something about new modalities, transformation, and there's something about life and light. It just struck me, by the way, just a moment ago. Why is our treasure house called the Philokalia? Why is the Orthodox, classic of spiritual theology called the Philokalia, the love of beauty, the love of the beautiful good? Why not philosophy? And then I thought, I've been listening to Gary Saul Morrison give some lectures on philosophy and wisdom and death. I thought, philosophy is wrapped up with mortality, right? Beauty is wrapped up with creation. It's nicer. All right, that aside, pardon me. Bottom third of 181. I want to read it again and just flag this. And I'm particularly, I would ask each of you in turn if I could. I'm very interested in what you make of this. I'm going to read the whole passage. And again, you illuminate from the eternal mountains, from the immaterial mountains, with all knowledge that transcends the senses, and the power of the words and dogmas of the fathers, those who desire light and by the taste of wisdom are already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing. As you lead and introduce them, baptize, reverently to that complete transformation through experience. And again, you illuminate from the eternal mountains, from the immaterial mountains, with all knowledge that transcends the senses, and the power of the words and dogmas of the fathers, those who desire light and by the taste of wisdom are already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing, as you lead and introduce them reverently to that complete transformation through experience, through pira. Now, I solicit each and all of you, if you'd like to work through this word by word, for heaven's sake, help me figure it out, help me enlighten me. I'm particularly interested in the phrases that occur after the word fathers, as I said them before. Those who desire light, okay, that's fair enough. That's deep, but not obscure. And by the taste of wisdom, okay, taste, and then here, are already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing. As you lead and introduce them reverently. say? Yes, which is God, yes. As you lead and introduce them reverently to that complete transformation through experience. That to me is just, there's worlds packed in there. Each, any, each. What do you make of it? Knowledge which transcends the senses, so noetic knowledge. Or is it knowledge which transcends the senses and the power of the words, so noetic and apophatic knowledge, and then and dogmas of the Father? No, it's all knowledge of the Fathers and the rest is parenthetical. All knowledge of the Fathers, yeah. Who desire light. In our creed, the divine is called light of light, true God of true God. That's fair enough. Who desire light. The taste of wisdom. I wonder at that. I don't know what that means. Maybe he means the acquired taste of wisdom, the habit of wisdom, maybe. And the next phrase, David Goa, if I can pick on you first, because I know you best. What do you make of that? Are already formed through hope. So hope is transformative immediately. It's not just projected. Already formed through hope into the image of that. Okay, fair enough. Which is the natural object of their longing. So object is a little bit risky, but the natural end, say, of their longing, of their desire. Natural, that's fine. As David Jennings said, that's clearly God, right? The natural inclination of the human person is towards the divine.
Well, hope, I mean, hope is that disposition toward what is coming to greet you. You know, that stance of attentiveness to what is unfolding. And maybe one way of thinking about it is considering what's at work when the person doesn't have any hope, when they are in fact cut off. And so the desire for light, the taste of wisdom, the capacity for experience.
I like that. Stands for, oh, pardon me, David. Pardon me.
Just if one goes back a little earlier, you know, For it is not so much by words of teaching as by act of example that those who wisely direct their minds and their life towards you are led to the depth of virtue. You know, to answer, it's not to answer, but to contribute to your question, Andrew, that you raised, you know, of different measurements of time. You know, John 17, what is it? I can't remember, 33, something like that, where it says, you know, and this is eternal life, to know God and Jesus Christ through him. It's not a time-based, you know, so I don't view eternal life as a time measurement. I think it's a qualitative. It's us actually living within the knowledge of Christ. That intimacy with Christ is so one can have eternal life now, not just in the future. And this speaks to not just simply head knowledge, although, you know, the turning of the mind is exceptionally important in Scripture, but through active example. I find it interesting that and maybe I don't want to put too much weight on it, but he then speaks about those who rave and run riot from deceit, madness, and wicked deeds and fraudulent words, convicting them of unsoundness and purposelessness. But then he speaks to another group, which might be helpful. He speaks about the warmth of the Spirit, the heat that comes from the Spirit. And then he writes, you warm those who seek refuge with this frozen product. It might be pregnant with something for Lorraine there, that when we speak of that frozen nature of us being frozen with the product of that other than of the Spirit, which warms and thaws us out from that. But as we go further here, the description here I thought was and this is someone from the outside, so I may be completely off, but I think it's a description of deification. That it's not deification, from what I've read so far, seems to be more than, it's kind of like the Kierkegaard, you know, either or, but beyond that virtue only gets you so far, and then there's more than that. And that is getting into the place where one not only loves another as you love yourself, but actually to come to a place where you love the other more than yourself. And it's that deification process. And here, whose desired light and by the taste of wisdom already formed through hope into the image of that which is the natural object of their longing, as you lead and introduce them reverently to the complete transformation through experience. Elsewhere, when in his writings, it strikes me that he's describing the process of deification there.
I think you're right. And sorry, may I respond?
Yeah,
or were you going to go on?
I haven't got anything else.
Okay, pardon me. No, that was lots. I have three connected thoughts I want to get out. I think that yes, it is clear he's talking about deification, but he's not saying it in those terms. So he's implying that it's not rarefied.
Right.
That's one. Second, I think that yes, the whole notion of deification as a kind of the goal of spiritual progress is beyond the virtues. I'd say beyond, not after, because I think it's greater than. I think the virtues might be hindrances sometimes. Yeah, we're speaking familiar. Third, I think that you're right that earlier when I was querying these notions of time, I was essentially working within a form of negative theology, not apophatic, not beyond. So I was still allowing the thing to be defined by what it is not. And that's fair enough. But I was interested in the images we have for this, just on that level. I realize we have to move past those images because I think you're absolutely right. It's supremely unwise. This goes back to one of our beginning to endure concerns, which is the care with precision of images or terminology, right? I think you're exactly right that even this language of time is partial, so we're very careful. And then I want to, David, I want to come back to something you said and make a little link and open or ask you something. You talked about hope being a stance. Often it's sort of a projection or something, a movement. And you're saying, no, it's a kind of a steadiness, a stance towards. And then I think stance, in a way, I don't mean this to be glib, but in a way is related to stasis. It's an enduring thing. It's a thing which stays, which is, right? We don't speak of it in terms of movement. We speak of it in terms of stayingness, maybe. Stance, stasis. Maybe when we, and this is just opening maybe horizon, maybe when we find ourselves talking about human life in terms of becoming, maybe what we're also, I'll say also talking about, is human life in terms of the stance through which one undergoes becoming. Because that stance or disposition or ethos or kind of, I call it a directedness of the soul, that basic kind of righteous upright orientation, kind of righteousness, to hearken back to the ancient sense of that. That through becoming is what we are. I wonder about that. So maybe the ontological model is not simply one of, stasis or kinesis, as I had previously imagined in my mind. But David, what do you make of that? What do you think? Good. That's good.
So would hopeful, just being sure that I'm clear, says it's sort of like hopeful is almost the adjective or the adverb against becoming. So like a hopeful becoming. Is that where we're going? I just want to make sure, like, it's not perfect, but is that what you're suggesting, Andrew? That there is an importance to how you engage in this becoming, because you could do it, I guess, quite. And I
I
certainly
see.
have seen,
Yes.
I've seen it quite
Yeah.
negative. Like I resentfully become, I sort of bitterly become, or I just want to make sure that I understood or I've misunderstood what you meant.
No, pardon me. I hesitated for a moment because I hearken back to hope with it as the disposition. But I understand what you mean. Yeah, that if the stance or the disposition is what endures, and that's what is us, as it were, in becoming, then yes, one hopefully becomes. Yeah, that's a way of talking about it. Or, God forbid, dismally becomes, or God forbid, helplessly, or all of these other awful valleys of the shadow of death through which humans travel. Yeah.
Can I just ask a
Michael
question?
Burke, what?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I was going to
prefer to hear
tend another way.
Lorraine, but sorry.
I'll get back to you, Michael. Go on, Lorraine. Go in, please.
I guess so. I just have a question on that. Based on Maximus's understanding, then can we stop becoming, or does becoming really the directionality of becoming really depends then on that disposition? In other words, like hopeful versus dismal, right? But I guess I'm wondering, according to Maximus, can we ever undo becoming? Can we ever stop becoming, or is becoming an eternal movement, and it really just depends which way we're going?
Yeah, because if the stance doesn't transform the becoming, it remains becoming, which is eternal, which is nothing. It's always just going. Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful.
But ultimately, Maximus does say that we're in a dynamic rest. So there is something beyond the becoming.
But does that involve struggle? That's the thing. Then we talk about synergy. Well, I agree. No, I agree, David. That's what I'm saying. But if we struggle, yes. But if as I think I understand Lorraine to be saying, if the becoming is a hopeless becoming, if struggle
Oh, yeah.
doesn't, as David Goa said, if one can't respond to that thing which seems so immediate to
Right.
one, then does that becoming become hell? I think that's what she's
Yeah.
saying. That's an amazing thought. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I like that a lot. Huh.
Is there an opposition, David, David Jennings, between dynamic rest and becoming? I mean, I'm not sure how becoming is used, but I mean, is that something that we should, I guess this is kind of obliquely kind of related to Lorraine's question about can we stop becoming? So is that what dynamic rest is? Is it a contrast, or can they be, could you still be in a state of becoming if you're in dynamic rest? The reason I ask this is because you know, it's maybe from a very obvious standpoint, but from a mortal thought or from our finitude, it seems that deification, and I recall reading this somewhere, I can't find a reference, but it seems to me that deification, well, a couple of times when Maximus talks about deification, he almost immediately says, insofar as it's possible, and there seems to be it would, because God is infinite, it would always be not consummate or finished thing. Yeah, you can probably get what I'm sort of driving at.
I'm the wrong person to answer it, but I do think that the whole process of becoming makes you more aware of the total mystery of God, which feeds your becoming. You know, like as you get closer, you get further away, because you realize just that it isn't a fixed post. That mountain looks high and a certain distance until you start climbing, and then it's just that much further away. I don't think that causes hopelessness. I think it's that pursuit that's there. But I think that hopelessness could arise if one thought there was no possible end.
Ooh, yeah, interesting.
Or
There's
if
this.
the
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
or if the ever-moving repose, the dynamic stasis, is indeed meant to only lead to an end, if it not is itself the ongoing fullness or the ongoing culmination of something. Yeah, Michael, I wanted to say briefly that little parenthetical, to the degree possible or to the degree granted. I remember a couple of weeks ago, David and I were talking, he was reading something, and that kind of phrase came up. We paused over it in Max, because it's wonderful. And then one realizes that what he's saying there is, something, deification, comma, to the degree possible, something, theology. That to the degree possible, that's humanity. That's the non-theology. That's him pausing the definitions and saying, and look at this wonderful, world of variation, all of which are engaged in the same thing to the degree possible. That's what I think of anyways. And I think it's beautiful. I think that he intended that, because he uses that phrase a lot: to the degree possible, to the degree granted by grace, to the degree God has given. He's talking about measures. He's talking about the economy of God, right? Yeah.
He's very
David Goa,
tender.
am I off?
He's very tender about our limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. you know what, Lorraine, actually, and sorry, not just you, I think others too, but let's look at page 41 to 42 in this one, just briefly. And I would like, this is another one of those moments where I'm going to read something and say, please explain it to me. Okay. Because it's when the editors of this volume make the distinction between epectasis, the ever progression towards the divine, as understood by Gregory of Nyssa, his predecessor of Maximus, and Maximus himself. And my note is that it involves a concern for delineation. I think the Maximus wanted to delineate something a little bit more carefully than thought St. Gregory had. But look halfway down 41 in the blue book. We see that word with mode, tropos, so mode ability. Understood pejoratively as deviance, or by the Origenists as the ability to stall out in the good through a spiritual surfeit, choros, by imagining the soul engaged in a perpetual progress or striving. That's the term, perpetual progress or striving, epectasis, to embrace its ultimate desirable, God. Maximus appropriates Nyssa's concept, but not without revision. Cautious that such perpetual change for the better would simply amount to the soul's endless overcoming of an inherent capacity to stray from its true destiny, or even to stall because of its satiety. Cautious that such a perpetual change for the better would simply amount to the soul's endless overcoming of an inherent capacity to stray from its true destiny, or even to stall because of satiety. Maximus applies his distinction between a creature's mutable mode of existence and its ontologically prior natural principle. The main things there are tropos and logos. Mode of existence is tropos, and natural principle is logos, which comprehends and stabilizes its existential moments. Nevertheless, Maximus fundamentally concurs with Gregory that because God is utterly infinite, and because the most natural human drive is an appetitive longing for the divine, appetite not in the way that David defined it last time. David Go defined it last time. No creature can truly exhaust its progress or be sated in communion with God. Even in the afterlife, and then here, David Jennings, this is you, deification is an ever-moving repose, or stasis, eternally moving in God. And what did you call it, David Jennings? What was the term?
I think I used dynamic, a dynamic rest that I saw
rest,
elsewhere.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, same thing, right? The sensation, but the sense of movement, of vitality, but and then I don't know, we get tangled up again. Enduringness, sameness, similarity, rest at least. So something is not moving or not changing, it seems. This absurdity, not absurdity, conundrum at the center. But what do you make of that? Because these are two of the, I mean, we're talking about images. We're always talking about images and precision. These are two of the finest and by far most influential images of spiritual progress in the Orthodox tradition right here. As articulated by Gregory of Nyssa, he's better known. So his is a little bit better known, I'd say, and by Maximus.
The preoccupation of Protestants on this issue is works righteousness, that I have to earn God's favor. And so this eternal progression can very easily slip into a I have to do it in order to. I think both Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus are clearly saying something different than that, but I just flag that that's where I would think lots of people come from, where they have to do it or earn it. So this
David, do you think
eternal
that,
engagement. Sorry, go ahead.
pardon me, I was just going to say, do you think that that is the idol of the true spiritual struggle? You're talking about a kind of frenzy or frenetic activity. I didn't mean to interrupt. Pardon me, I did, but
No.
pardon me. I meant
Yeah.
to ask you that and continue.
Yeah, I don't think that the idol is the frenetic activity. I think that's the consequence of the idol, which is the idol is that I'm in control. Or that.
Okay, in that sense, yeah, fine.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
So
Okay.
I think that this is what I love about the restoration of all things, is that it completely takes the air out of an overinflated tire. Like it just says, like just, whoa. If you think that somehow someday you're going to not only apprehend but comprehend God, like get in the back seat and just let someone else drive for a while. And this, the pursuit of virtue itself is a very difficult task, but it's nowhere adequate to actually achieve this dynamic rest. There's the deification that goes far beyond just simply being virtuous. And I think that as one, that love is the ultimate way in which one knows God. Of all the attributes that might be ascribed to him, it's love. I think that's where, because love requires the giving to the other and the care for the other. And that sort of gets rid of the human need to control. You can't control love. You can't control relationship that way. Anyway, listen, I'm now meandering and it's after 10 or after whatever time zone you guys are in. But I think that
Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
If love indicates our God, right? If I understand you, and then to go back to Lorraine's image of the kind of emotional stasis being the filter through which becoming. So then, what we're doing in selfishness or in self-love, which is satanic, which is the opposite, which is the Antichrist. To be clear, we're talking about love and self-love, not anything else. That's the original metaphor. So love can be misdirected. If love can be misdirected, then it makes sense why Maximus would say, love is the thing most apt, not the thing which will. To go back to some of his earlier language, his care, the care around which he applies these terms to these moments or these things in life, these parts of life which are so significant. Yeah, no, I'm with you. Pardon me. Yeah, please. Yeah. Pardon me.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to have to hop off. I'm actually a couple minutes late for a meeting, but thank you so much for tonight. It was fantastic. I've got lots to think about, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thank you for,
And you gave us lots, Lorraine. Thanks so much. That was great.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay,
Ciao,
that's
ciao.
wonderful. I'll see you in 2 weeks, everyone. Cheers.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye. Yeah, it's almost, I think David might have said this the last time we met, that the phrase self-love is almost oxymoronic, that one can't have love. The defining characteristics of love is outward, and one can't have self-love in that sense. You can have love that's not reciprocated. So perhaps you can have love of lesser things, the golden calf type situation. But self-love is almost, you'd almost think is an ontological impossibility, but we all know what we're talking about here. So yeah, I think you're
So
right
hold
that
on.
John, that apt versus it's not predestined that you get that, and because love is a dynamic relationship within, so it doesn't get into predestination that way.
I really like that, David. I really like that. May I provoke you for a moment, slightly?
Okay.
Maybe.
Sure.
Okay,
No.
if or poke,
Yeah.
poke,
Yeah.
poke, maybe.
Poke. Go ahead.
If,
Yeah.
because I actually agree with what you just said, with everything you just said. But I want to wonder for a moment. I'd like to put it on you.
Mhm.
If love is love, even if it's not reciprocated, right? You said, right? That's fair enough.
Yep.
I heard you.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Then fair enough. But then love may be unidirectional.
Yeah.
Now, if human personhood is relational at its essence, is relational in sum, and is relational at its summit, then love, not needing to be relational, would be a lesser element of the human person, would it not?
Well, if we're talking about
And
divine love, we don't have that problem because the well, actually, you know what? Divine love can be unilateral as well, and that people don't reciprocate to God. So that also is, and that is probably the greatest unilateral form of love, is God's love for all of humanity, well, yeah, let's stick with humanity, all of humanity that isn't reciprocated. But I don't think that makes it lesser.
well, that's what I'm saying. That immediately seems to prove that my argument doesn't work. So why am I wrong? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Why is this not a good counter? Because I agree, and I mean I defer completely to someone like Maximus. This is love is the supreme virtue, the height of the human. He teaches us. So I'm not challenging that. I'm playing a little bit of a cheekiness here.
I don't know. It's a good question.
It's about reciprocal.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
And love that is love, you may not experience it as reciprocal, but it is always given to God as well as to that which is everything else that is loved.
Right.
And the reciprocal part of it has to do with our way of seeing it. And our way of seeing it is always limited. And
if our relationship to creation, to other people, and to all things is through Christ, that high Christology, then I cannot love my wife. I cannot have even lesser loves, the love of knowledge or the love of whatever, without that love also being to Christ. And Christ will always reciprocate that love.
That's nice. No, I think you do dance nicely around this, and I don't mean that cheaply. I mean that's lovely.
No.
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's.
It's always a trinity. It's always a trinity,
babe.
It's always. Come on.
It's the
But
Sunday
there's
school
always
answer.
a divine involved. There's always a divine involved.
Yeah.
And this is something that David taught me a while ago, that you never just have, say, person. You have person and creation and the divine. So there's always, it's never, and this harkens back to something which was introduced last time, especially in the way that David Goy, you talked about the letter being addressed. You spoke about the friendship and what that means. And I thought, yeah, but Maximus is writing to his friend, but as if his friend is the world too. And you brought this up. And I thought, so it's not just, local, it's the person is the model of the cosmos, so that this is the cosmos is in the person. So you address one or together, it's the same thing. When we hold those together, well, then, as you say, David Goa, the notion of reciprocity exposes its true colors, which is a partly useful term when dealing with a strictly dualistic situation, right? And I don't mean that negatively. You could have a great friendship and talk about reciprocity. That would be good. That'd be important. Or, a marriage even. But in the fullness of these relationships, it wouldn't be adequate. It would be much less. I like that.
Again, from my heritage, the one caution, and I have seen nothing in Maximus that would cause me concern, but just from the way we think of things, the Platonic ideal of love is too often used in Christian circles to define God. But of course, it's God who defines love, not love that defines God. And so we always have to keep that in mind as we talk about love being the greatest understanding of who God is that the love is not a Platonic ideal under which God is then defined.
I concur. And I think that temptation is palpable, partly because it's so good and it's so beautiful. It's so absolutely beautiful that is true. And it is true. It is true, right? But I think that in terms of strength of metaphor, I think that we have to be careful. Again, try to move into apophatic territory where we move, from within the word to beyond the word, as we looked at earlier, from within to beyond, right? And I think of, and Michael, I'm looking at you. I think of, the Gospel of St. John, which I never read because it makes me just weep every time I read 3 sentences. It's so beautiful. But at the very beginning, we have this word, the Logos. Michael, many, many times, I've been longing to ask you this for years. And I'm not asking you now, but I want to ask you over the next months. Many times you refer to the Logos as the unifying principle in history, as the distinction of Christianity, as the ultimate, a number of different sort of things, neutrally, not pejoratively or anything like that. I'm not saying that you're being this or that about it. I'm just saying you were thinking about it. And I think that Logos, that deeply, deeply strange word, is tempers our apprehension of this other notion that God is love. I think they're.
I think that's yeah.
Go on, Michael. Go on.
No,
I was going to say I think they're paratactic. I think they're beside each other.
This is sort of I think to reinforce what David was saying. I would characterize the contrary attitude as potentially, this is being a little overly dramatic, but potentially being nihilistic. Because there is a ghastly nihilistic thought that it ends it comes towards, it comes at the very end of Nietzsche's probably most admired work among intellectuals. And I'm sort of wondering about this puzzle of why it's such an admired work. And I think there's probably some disturbing things there. But okay, so putting all that aside, is that he says, the author of, the will to power is, behind everything, that human beings at one point, and it was a little bit more promising, seek, and he's directing this against the English hedonism or utilitarianism, that we just seek what pleasure. And he makes that famous joke about, only the Englishman seeks pleasure, but and then he says, human beings seek meaning, even if it brings about great suffering. They can put up with great suffering if it's meaningful suffering. And I think he's in a tradition that he's in the Christian tradition here. But
Dostoevsky said this. Dostoevsky.
That's right. Yeah, and there are a lot of affinities with Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And then he ends, and this would all be also another affinity with Dostoevsky, maybe, Notes from Underground, that rather than will nothing, and you could say rather than also desire nothing, rather than love nothing, human beings would have a will to nothingness. And that's sort of an end point of his whole rhetoric, and it's something that he's worried about and ought to be. And without love or desire being attached to the logos, I think that is a trajectory, an abysmal trajectory that we're heading toward. And I think Nietzsche intimated that. That's why he's not particularly gleeful about his sociological statement, about the death of the logos, or Christian metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
I was putting all this in sort of more philosophical terms, just but it's not it's a blunter way of talking, not as rich as the whole antecedent conversations this afternoon.
It's interesting that ultimately, although the Christian tradition talks about, let's say, to use moral terms, the good and the bad, not in, say, combative or oppositional terms, but in, let's say, negation terms, being and non-being sort of thing, Christ and Antichrist. What it really ultimately ends up in terms of image, and again, I have to be careful with image, isn't something in its opposite image or its counter image. It's something and it's exactly the same but entirely different image, right? The angel of light or the Antichrist, that which stands in place of Christ, which isn't Christ but which looks like Christ, and which is Christ but which is not Christ because it's not Christ because it's the Antichrist, but it looks like. It goes back to love, self-love, right? They look very, very similar. And Michael, your point about finding meaning, if you can find meaning in nothing, then you can kind of be saved, or that gives you that's a help. So the finding meaning, that's where discernment lies. The lack of finding meaning, that's what I want to ask. Where does that land us? If the image is two things which look alike, but one is genuine and one is counterfeit, but that discernment is needed to get to one or the other, or at least some movement is needed, some kind of choice, some kind of not this, but this. Then what does the lack of choice indicate, if that's possible? Or is that a tired question? Forgive me if I'm going.
I think it's a great question to kick off next time we meet.
Yeah.
It requires some time.
Quickly, David, what are we looking at next time? Let me look here. We're looking at this book on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, pages 97 to 108.
Okay.
I'll send out a recording. Oh, here, I'll pause. Yes, stop the recording.